A journey of solitude. Eric's breath fogged in the cold air, each exhale like a ghost floating into the stillness around him. The crunch of his boots against the snow was the only sound as he trekked through the vast expanse of white. He had been hiking for hours, losing himself in the serenity of the Alaskan wilderness. For Eric, this was more than just a routine trip. It was a pilgrimage, a return to the place that had shaped so much of who he was. As a child, Eric had spent countless winters exploring these very mountains with his father. They had skied, hiked, and camped together, creating memories that Eric clung to long after his father's passing. The small cabin, nestled between towering pines and frost-laden peaks, had been their shared retreat from the world. Now, it stood as Eric's sanctuary, a place where he could connect with the ghost of his father in the only way he knew how. It had been 7 years since his father had succumbed to cancer, leaving Eric adrift in a world that no longer made sense. Grief had a way of closing doors, and in Eric's case, it had shut him off from everything and everyone, including his mother. The once close-knit relationship they shared had faded into strained silence. She couldn't fill the void his father had left behind, and despite her efforts, Eric drifted further into his own world. The mountains were his escape. They were the one place where the overwhelming grief seemed to ebb, replaced by the quiet reassurance of the natural world. Up here, with the vast skies stretching endlessly above him, he could almost feel his father's presence. It was in the crackle of the wind through the trees, the scent of pine on the air, and the echo of his footsteps across the snow. On this particular trip, however, something was different. Eric couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had gripped him since he arrived. Maybe it was the news report he had seen that morning, warning hikers of a recent wolf attack. The footage had been graphic, blood staining the snow, and a shaken survivor recounting the terrifying encounter. Wolves were not uncommon in these parts, but they were rarely aggressive. This particular pack, however, had been driven closer to the trails by hunger, their natural prey scarce due to the heavy snows. Eric had taken note of the warning, but he wasn't overly concerned. After all, he had been hiking these mountains for years without incident. His instincts were sharp, honed from a lifetime of experience. Still, the image of those wolves haunted him as he set off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. The sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow as Eric neared the summit. He paused to take in the view. The world spread out beneath him like a blanket of pure white. It was breathtaking, the kind of beauty that made the long trek worth every moment. But as he stood there, a low rumble echoed through the mountains, subtle at first, but growing in intensity. Eric's pulse quickened. He knew that sound. It was the unmistakable warning of an avalanche. His breath hitched, and his eyes darted toward the ridge, where the snow was beginning to shift. A massive crack zigzagged across the mountainside, and within seconds, the entire slope gave way. Tons of snow thundered down the mountainside in a white, unstoppable wall of destruction. Panic seized Eric. He was far enough from the danger zone, but his gaze was fixed on the path of the avalanche, where he had seen movement just moments before. Wolves. A pack of wolves, right in the path of the deadly snow. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as he watched in horror. They didn't stand a chance. The avalanche consumed everything in its path, and within seconds, the wolves were gone, buried beneath a deadly blanket of ice and snow. Eric stood frozen, his mind racing. He had to do something, but fear rooted him to the spot. His instincts told him to stay away. The wolves were dangerous, especially now, if any of them had survived. But as the seconds ticked by, another thought pushed its way to the forefront of his mind. Those wolves were trapped, suffocating, dying. I can't just leave them, he whispered to himself, the words lost in the cold wind. Against his better judgment, Eric began to move. His body acted on autopilot, his legs carrying him toward the site of the avalanche, even as his mind screamed at him to turn back. The snow was deep, making every step a struggle, but he pushed on, driven by an inexplicable need to help. As he reached the edge of the avalanche zone, he could see the faint outlines of where the snow had settled. The pack had been caught directly in the slide, their once clear tracks now a jumbled mess of disturbed snow and debris. Eric's breath came in ragged gasps as he surveyed the scene. He had no idea where to start, but he knew time was running out. Dropping to his knees, he began to dig, his hands plunging into the snow with desperate speed. It was slow work, painstakingly slow, and the cold bit into his fingers, even through his gloves. Every second felt like an eternity, but Eric kept going, driven by a strange sense of duty. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, and just when Eric thought he would collapse from exhaustion, his hand brushed something solid. Fur. His heart leaped into his throat as he dug faster, his fingers working frantically to uncover the wolf. He couldn't tell if it was alive, but he had to hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he uncovered the wolf's head. It was one of the larger ones, probably the alpha, its body limp and unresponsive. For a moment, Eric's heart sank, but then the wolf stirred, a faint, shallow breath escaping its nose. It was alive. Barely. Eric knew he had to act fast. There were others buried beneath the snow, and every second mattered. Without thinking, he continued to dig, his exhaustion forgotten in the face of the task at hand. As he worked, a new fear began to creep into his mind. What would happen when the wolves woke up? Would they attack him? The news report flashed through his mind again. The savage image of that hiker's torn clothing and the fear in their eyes. These wolves had already proven they could be dangerous, and now they were wounded and vulnerable. Eric pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the task in front of him. There was no time for fear. By the time he uncovered the second wolf, a smaller one, possibly a cub, Eric's muscles were burning, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He was on the brink of collapse, but he kept going, knowing that he couldn't stop now. As the minutes ticked by, Eric uncovered more of the pack, 3 adult wolves and 2 cubs, all of them alive, though weak. They lay in the snow, their bodies shivering as they slowly regained consciousness. Eric backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. What would they do next? The moment of truth. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the desolate landscape, illuminating the stark contrast of the pure white snow against the shadows of the towering pines. As Eric stood there, panting heavily, he could hardly comprehend what had just transpired. He had risked everything to save these wolves, and now, as he gazed upon them, a mix of hope and dread surged within him. The alpha wolf lay still, its breath shallow and labored. Eric's heart raced as he took a cautious step back, not wanting to provoke it. The smaller wolves were slowly stirring, their eyes blinking open to the world, dazed and disoriented. Eric watched as they took in their surroundings, their instincts kicking in, but the gravity of their situation seemed to tether them to the spot. What have I done? Eric whispered to himself, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He had freed them from their snowy tomb, but what lay ahead was an unknown territory filled with potential danger. Would they see him as a savior or a threat? As he considered this, the alpha wolf began to move, its body rising slightly from the snow. Eric held his breath, his body tense, every instinct screaming at him to run. The wolf's golden eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, time stood still. The two beings, man and wolf, shared a brief connection, an understanding that transcended the barriers of species. The alpha's gaze shifted to the younger wolves, and with a low, almost imperceptible growl, it encouraged them to stand. Eric observed as the smaller wolves struggled to their feet, trembling but determined. One of the cubs, a ball of fluff and energy, yelped softly, its voice barely carrying over the wind. "Please don't attack me," Eric thought desperately, wishing he could convey his intentions with mere thoughts. "I just wanted to help." He remembered the stories his father had told him by the fireside, the tales of bravery and loyalty among wolves. They were creatures of family and instinct, fierce protectors of their own. Eric's heart ached for the pack, for the bond they shared that was now under threat due to their dire circumstances. But what if they viewed him as a threat to their survival? The alpha took a cautious step toward Eric, its body tense, muscles coiling like a spring. Eric held his ground, his heart pounding in his ears. The world around him faded, and all that existed was the wolf before him, an embodiment of nature's raw power and elegance. As the alpha advanced, its growl morphed into a soft whine, a sound that surprised Eric. He had expected aggression, but instead, it was a sound of vulnerability. The alpha paused, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air, assessing the situation. Eric remained still, breathing shallowly, hoping the creature could sense the truth in his heart. Suddenly, a sharp yelp erupted from one of the cubs. Eric turned his head just in time to see the little one struggling to rise. It was caught in the remnants of snow that had collapsed around it. Panic shot through Eric, and without thinking, he took a step forward, kneeling beside the cub. As he reached out to help, the alpha wolf moved in front of him, its eyes narrowing in warning. Eric froze, his hands suspended in the air, heart racing. "Wait, I'm not going to hurt it," he called out softly, sensing the urgency of the moment. "I'm here to help." He held his breath, waiting for the alpha's reaction. The wolf remained tense, muscles rippling under its thick fur, but it didn't growl. Instead, it watched him intently, assessing his intentions. Taking a calculated risk, Eric carefully brushed away the snow from the cub, exposing its soft, vulnerable body. The little creature whimpered, its tiny body shivering violently in the cold. The alpha seemed to understand, slowly inching closer as if to convey that it wouldn't harm him as long as he posed no threat to its young. With a gentle touch, Eric grasped the cub and lifted it free, cradling it against his chest. The warmth of its small body was a stark contrast to the biting cold of the Alaskan air. He felt a wave of relief wash over him as he glanced at the alpha, which remained watchful, its eyes flickering between Eric and its cub. "Just a little longer," he murmured, hoping the alpha could understand his sincerity. One by one, he freed the remaining cubs from the snow. Each time he moved, the alpha observed him closely, its body language shifting from aggressive tension to cautious curiosity. With each cub rescued, the bond of trust began to grow, though it was still tenuous at best. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, all the young wolves were free, their tiny bodies racked with shivers, seeking warmth and comfort. Eric felt a rush of adrenaline as he realized he had accomplished what he set out to do, but now the reality of his situation dawned on him. The pack was still vulnerable, and they were far from safety. Now what? He pondered aloud, glancing at the alpha, which had yet to relax. Would the pack attempt to return to the den? Would they seek shelter? It was too risky to remain in the open, especially given the avalanche's threat lingering overhead. Eric's instincts kicked in once again. He recalled his father's teachings about wildlife. Wolves, when in danger, would seek refuge in areas that offered protection. Eric spotted a nearby cluster of trees, their thick trunks standing tall against the harsh landscape. The trees might provide cover from the harsh winds and a semblance of safety. "Follow me," he urged softly, taking a few cautious steps toward the trees. He turned back to check on the wolves, and to his surprise, the alpha followed closely, the rest of the pack trailing behind. With careful steps, Eric led the way through the snow, each movement deliberate as he maintained a cautious distance. The alpha remained close, watching him with vigilant eyes, while the cubs followed, their tiny feet struggling to keep pace. As they reached the thicket of trees, Eric turned to face them, relief flooding his senses. He had done it. He had saved them from certain death, and now they were safely tucked away from the remnants of the avalanche. Eric dropped to one knee, his breath heavy as he surveyed the pack. They were shaken but alive. The cubs nestled against each other, seeking warmth, while the alpha stood protectively over them, its eyes locked on Eric, still wary but no longer aggressive. In that moment, Eric felt an overwhelming sense of connection with the pack. They were survivors, just like him. He had lost so much, yet here he was, standing between life and death for these magnificent creatures. As he looked into the eyes of the alpha, he understood that their fates were intertwined in this fleeting moment. "I know I'm just a human," Eric spoke softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I want to help you." The alpha remained silent, but its posture softened slightly, and Eric took it as a sign of acceptance. They were all in this together now. He remembered the supplies he had in his backpack, some trail mix, granola bars, and a thermos of hot tea he had packed for himself. It wouldn't be much, but it might help sustain them until they could find a safe place to rest. With renewed determination, Eric retrieved his backpack and rummaged through it, pulling out the thermos and a few snacks. He poured a small amount of tea into a bottle cap, careful not to scare the wolves. The alpha watched closely, its eyes keenly observing every movement. "Here, this might help," he said gently, holding out the cap filled with steaming tea. To his amazement, the alpha approached cautiously, sniffing the warm liquid before lapping it up tentatively. As the tea disappeared, Eric felt a spark of hope. The other wolves, especially the cubs, began to approach, their tiny bodies still trembling from the cold. He offered them pieces of granola bar, watching as they nibbled cautiously, their eyes wide with curiosity. For the first time, Eric allowed himself to relax a little. He had crossed a threshold, from fear to trust, and the bond between him and the wolves began to grow. In the stillness of the forest, surrounded by towering trees and the soft whispers of the wind, Eric felt a flicker of connection, a bond forged not only in the desperate fight for survival, but in shared vulnerability. The wolves were not just wild animals. They were living, breathing beings, and he was their unlikely protector. As night began to fall, casting long shadows across the snow, Eric felt the weight of the world lift slightly from his shoulders. He had saved the wolves, but they were still far from safety. The night promised dangers yet unseen, and the avalanche had only been a warning of what could come. "We need to find a place to stay," Eric murmured, looking at the alpha, which regarded him with newfound respect. "Let's find shelter for tonight." With the pack gathered close, he led them deeper into the woods, every step taken with care. They were all navigating the treacherous path of survival together, and as Eric moved forward, he felt a deepening sense of purpose. Perhaps in saving them, he could find a way to heal his own heart, rekindling the warmth of the love he had lost. As they ventured into the darkening woods, Eric felt the spirit of his father guiding him, as if whispering wisdom through the rustling leaves and the quiet sigh of the wind. Together, man and wolf, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united by a bond forged in the heart of the wilderness. A night in the wilderness. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the Alaskan wilderness transformed into a shadowy realm of muted colors and deepening blues. As the chill of night settled over the forest, Eric led the wolf pack deeper into the woods, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The air was thick with the scents of pine and earth, while the sounds of the wilderness whispered secrets that only those attuned to nature could hear. Eric's thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to the stories his father used to tell him about the creatures of the wild. The night would often bring the sounds of wolves howling in the distance, a haunting yet beautiful melody that echoed through the valleys. In those moments, Eric had felt a strange connection to the wild, as if the very essence of life was calling to him. Now, standing amidst the shadows, he was part of that world, a protector of those who had once been feared. The pack moved cautiously behind him, their instincts heightened, the alpha wolf leading the way with a sense of purpose. Eric glanced back at the cubs, their wide eyes glinting in the fading light, filled with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. He felt a swell of compassion for them, knowing they had just escaped a near-death experience. The warmth of the tea he had offered earlier had provided some comfort, but he knew they needed more than just sustenance. They needed safety. As they ventured deeper, Eric spotted a small clearing ahead, the ground carpeted with soft moss that would provide some insulation from the cold. Surrounding the clearing were clusters of thick trees, their branches entwined like protective arms, offering a semblance of shelter against the harsh elements. "This should do for tonight," he said, motioning toward the clearing. "It's safe here." The Alpha approached first, sniffing the air and assessing the surroundings. Eric could see it relax slightly, its posture shifting as it deemed the area safe for its pack. One by one, the wolves settled into the moss, the cubs curling up close to the Alpha, who stood watch over them, a silent sentinel. Eric dropped to the ground beside them, feeling the soft moss beneath his fingers. For a moment, he closed his eyes, taking a deep breath and letting the calm of the forest seep into his bones. He had been so focused on the immediate danger that he hadn't allowed himself to truly breathe, to appreciate the beauty of this moment. Suddenly, the sound of a twig snapping nearby pierced the stillness. Eric's heart raced, adrenaline flooding his system. He quickly scanned the darkness, his instincts sharp and alert. The Alpha wolf stiffened, its ears perked up, eyes narrowed in concentration. The other wolves raised their heads, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Stay calm," Eric whispered, keeping his voice low and steady. He had to project confidence, even if his heart was racing. A low growl emanated from the Alpha, vibrating through the air as if it were a warning. Eric felt a surge of respect for the creature. It was a leader, instinctively aware of the threats that lurked in the shadows. He remained still, listening intently, trying to discern the source of the noise. As the darkness deepened, the sounds of the forest came alive. The distant hoot of an owl echoed in the trees, while the rustle of leaves hinted at the presence of other creatures, possibly curious or hungry. Eric knew that in the wild, every creature had to contend with danger. Moments later, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the underbrush, and Eric's heart skipped a beat. The eyes were too large and too low to the ground to belong to anything friendly. He held his breath, instinctively reaching for his backpack, but then he realized that the Alpha had already taken a step forward, its growl deepening into a fierce snarl. "Hey, no," Eric called out, trying to hold the Alpha back. He could sense that the pack's survival instincts were kicking in, and the last thing he wanted was for the Alpha to confront whatever threat was out there without a plan. In the shadows, a small figure emerged, a fox, its fur a bright orange against the dark foliage. It paused for a moment, peering curiously at the pack before darting away, disappearing into the underbrush. Eric let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The Alpha relaxed, its growl fading as it turned back toward the cubs, who had watched the encounter with wide eyes. "That was close," Eric murmured, relief washing over him. He knew that even smaller creatures could pose threats, especially to the vulnerable cubs. But in this case, the encounter had ended peacefully, and that was something to be grateful for. As night settled in, the temperatures dropped rapidly. Eric knew they needed to conserve heat, both for himself and for the wolves. He rummaged through his backpack, pulling out a small emergency blanket he had always carried with him on hikes. "Here, this might help," he said, unfolding the shiny material and spreading it out on the ground. The Alpha watched with curiosity, its golden eyes glinting in the moonlight. "It reflects body heat." The wolves hesitated, unsure about this strange object. But as Eric beckoned to them, the cubs approached the blanket, nudging it with their noses. One by one, they climbed onto the reflective surface, huddling together for warmth. Eric smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over him. He then sat down on the edge of the blanket, drawing his knees up to his chest. "I'll keep watch," he said quietly, looking at the Alpha, which had taken a position nearby, its eyes scanning the dark forest. The night wore on, and the stars blinked brightly overhead, illuminating the landscape in a soft glow. The world felt both vast and intimate, the forest alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant calls of night creatures. Eric felt a deep sense of peace, an affirmation that he was exactly where he needed to be. But peace in the wild was often fleeting, and Eric knew they couldn't let their guard down. He remained vigilant, recalling the dangers he had faced while hiking in the past. He had encountered bears, moose, and even the occasional wolverine. The wilderness held its own rules, and they were not always forgiving. Hours passed, and Eric's mind wandered as he stared into the darkness, thoughts flickering like the stars above. He found himself reflecting on the weight of loss, his father's absence an ever-present shadow in his life. Memories flooded back, fishing trips, teaching him to build a fire, and those long nights spent listening to stories by the crackling fireplace. It was during those moments that Eric had learned to appreciate the beauty of nature, to respect its power, and to understand the fragility of life. Now, in this wilderness, he felt both the weight of his father's memory and the urgency of the present. It was as if the forest had woven their stories together, binding them in an eternal tapestry. Just as he was lost in thought, a sudden rustle in the underbrush drew his attention. Eric's instincts kicked in, and he quickly turned to face the noise. The alpha stood alert, its body tense, ready to defend its pack. "Stay close," Eric whispered, inching back toward the cubs, who had begun to stir. He hoped they would remain quiet, understanding the gravity of the situation. The rustling grew louder, and Eric's heart raced. What was out there? As the sound approached, a figure emerged from the darkness, and Eric's breath caught in his throat. A massive bear stepped into the clearing, its silhouette outlined by the silver moonlight. It paused, sniffing the air, and Eric could feel the raw power emanating from it. This was no ordinary bear. It was a grizzly, and it looked hungry. The alpha wolf stepped protectively in front of the cubs, its posture fierce, ready to defend its family at all costs. Eric's mind raced. He knew that bears could be territorial, especially if they felt threatened. He needed to think quickly. "We need to create a distraction," he thought, looking around for something he could use. He spotted a fallen branch nearby, large enough to throw but not too heavy to lift. With quick movements, he grabbed the branch and hurled it away from the clearing, hoping to divert the bear's attention. The branch landed with a thud, and the bear's head snapped in the direction of the noise. "Go! Now!" Eric urged, his voice low but firm. The alpha wolf took a protective step back, encouraging the cubs to move toward the trees. They stumbled but quickly followed the alpha's lead, darting into the thicker underbrush. The bear, intrigued by the noise, lumbered toward the fallen branch, momentarily distracted. Eric felt a surge of relief as he watched the wolves retreat safely. But he couldn't let his guard down. He needed to ensure they were all out of danger. Come on," he muttered under his breath, keeping his eyes fixed on the bear. It sniffed the ground, its powerful form shifting closer to Eric's last position. He crouched low, feeling the tension in the air as the bear continued to investigate. As the bear turned its back on him, Eric seized the opportunity and slipped into the shadows, following the wolves at a distance. He stayed low, careful to keep his movements quiet as he navigated through the underbrush. Finally, he spotted the alpha and the cubs huddled beneath a cluster of trees, their eyes wide with fear. He quickly joined them, his heart racing, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Are you all okay?" he whispered, watching the alpha nod slightly. The pack was shaken but unharmed. Just then, a low rumble echoed through the clearing, causing Eric to freeze. The bear had shifted, and he could hear it moving closer. He glanced back, seeing the massive creature lumbering toward the last place Eric had stood. They'll have to rely on their instincts, he thought, knowing that wolves were adept at evading larger predators. He hoped that the wilderness would offer them a way to escape, a chance to blend into the shadows. As the bear's heavy footsteps drew nearer, Eric felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of exhilaration. This was a test of survival, a dance between predator and prey, and he was a part of it. In that moment, he realized that he had embraced the wild in a way he never had before. The wolves, sensing Eric's presence, began to move stealthily, following the alpha as it led them deeper into the thicket. Together, they weaved through the trees, staying low to the ground, their movements almost silent. Eric felt an incredible bond forming between him and the wolves, a shared understanding of the urgency of survival. As they navigated the wilderness together, he knew they were all in this together, a pack united by necessity and instinct. But as they traveled deeper into the forest, Eric's mind raced with questions. Would they find safety? Would they face more dangers in the night? The uncertainties loomed over them like the dark shadows cast by the trees, but he knew one thing for certain: they had each other. The wilderness, with all its challenges, was also a place of beauty and resilience. And in that moment, Eric was not just a man in the wild. He was a part of something greater, a protector of those who could not defend themselves. The trials of survival. As dawn broke over the Alaskan wilderness, the first light of day revealed a landscape transformed by the night. The heavy blanket of snow shimmered under the sun's rays, casting a golden hue across the trees and the valley below. Eric felt a glimmer of hope as he stood among the wolves, their breaths forming tiny clouds in the crisp morning air. It was a new day, and with it came the promise of new challenges and opportunities. Eric had barely slept the night before, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The close encounter with the bear had awakened something primal within him. He realized he had to stay alert and resourceful, not just for himself, but for the pack that depended on him. As he watched the alpha wolf and its cubs, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. They were his family now. "Okay, team," he said, addressing the pack as if they could understand his words. "We need to find food and shelter. Let's stick together." Once the pack had eaten their fill, they moved on, leaving the remnants of the hunt behind. Eric felt invigorated, the experience fueling his spirit as they traversed the snow-covered landscape. He was becoming one with the wilderness, and with every step, he felt his bond with the wolves grow stronger. As they continued their journey, Eric became acutely aware of the changing environment. The trees began to thin, giving way to a more open area. The ground sloped downward, and Eric knew they were approaching a river. He had crossed this river many times as a child, but now it appeared different, the icy waters flowing swiftly beneath a crust of snow. "Be careful," he warned, watching the alpha assess the situation. The wolves paused, their noses twitching as they sniffed the air, testing for any signs of danger. The river was an obstacle, but it was also a lifeline, a source of water in the harsh winter. As they approached the riverbank, Eric noticed the tracks of other animals: moose, deer, and even more rabbits. It was clear that this was a gathering point for wildlife, a place where creatures came to drink and forage. But it was also a place of risk, where predators and prey converge. "Let's find a safe place to cross," Eric suggested, scanning the riverbank. He knew the currents could be treacherous, and the last thing they needed was for one of the wolves to slip on the ice. The alpha sniffed at the edge of the river, then looked back at Eric, seemingly understanding. Together, they walked along the bank until they found a section where the ice appeared thicker. "This looks good," Eric said, pointing to a narrow stretch that seemed stable. With caution, they began to cross, Eric moving slowly and deliberately. He felt the tension in the air as the wolves followed, their eyes fixed on him. Every crack of the ice beneath their feet sent a jolt of anxiety through him, but they pressed on, determined to reach the other side. Once they crossed safely, Eric let out a sigh of relief. The wolves shook off the cold and began to move deeper into the woods on the other side of the river. He followed closely, grateful for their guidance as they navigated the unfamiliar terrain. As the day wore on, the pack continued to make their way through the dense forest. Eric could feel the weariness settling in, his body aching from the exertion of the day. But there was no time for rest. They needed to find shelter before nightfall. As they traveled, Eric's mind began to wander again, drifting back to memories of his father. He could almost hear his voice, telling him to embrace the wild, to respect its beauty and danger. "You must learn to listen to the land," his father had said. "It will guide you, just like it guides the wolves." In that moment, Eric understood what his father had meant. The wilderness was alive, a tapestry of interconnected lives. He felt honored to be part of it, even for a short time. As evening approached, the sky turned a brilliant orange, casting long shadows across the snow. The air grew colder, and Eric knew they needed to find a place to hunker down for the night. Just then, the Alpha halted, sniffing the air. Eric watched intently as the wolf seemed to pick up on something. With a purposeful stride, the Alpha led the pack toward a nearby thicket, where a cluster of low-hanging branches created a natural shelter. "This will do nicely," Eric said, relief flooding through him as they settled into the thicket. It provided a windbreak and a sense of security, and the wolves curled up around him, their warm bodies offering comfort against the chill. As darkness fell, Eric couldn't shake the feeling of awe that enveloped him. Here he was, surrounded by wolves, the world outside fading into a quiet stillness. The crackle of the dying light echoed in his mind, and he felt an inexplicable connection to the wilderness that was now his home, at least for a while. With the pack beside him, he closed his eyes, drifting into a peaceful slumber. The worries of his past seemed to fade, replaced by the soft sounds of breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves. He was not alone in the wild. He had found his place among the wolves, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Into the heart of the wild. The night passed quietly, with only the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft snoring of the wolves breaking the silence. When dawn broke, Eric awoke to a world blanketed in fresh snow, a pristine layer that transformed the landscape into a winter wonderland. The air was crisp and cold, invigorating his senses. As he stretched and shook off the remnants of sleep, Eric felt a sense of purpose wash over him. He was no longer just a lost man seeking solace in the mountains. He was now part of a pack, sharing in the struggle and triumph of survival. The bond he had formed with the wolves was deepening, and he felt a connection to them that transcended words. The Alpha was already alert, surveying their surroundings with a keen eye. Eric watched the wolf, admiring its grace and strength. There was something about the way the Alpha held itself, confident yet cautious, that resonated with him. He too had to be vigilant if they were going to navigate this harsh landscape. "All right, everyone," he whispered, gathering the pack around him. "We need to figure out our next steps. We have food and shelter for now, but we can't stay here forever." The wolves seemed to understand, their expressions attentive. They gathered closely, their dark fur contrasting against the white snow, forming a living silhouette against the morning light. As they began to move out of the thicket, Eric noticed the tracks left in the snow from their overnight stay. The world around them was alive with possibilities. Food, danger, adventure. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp, cold air. The scent of pine and earth invigorated him, and he felt a renewed sense of determination. They continued deeper into the forest, following the Alpha as it led them along familiar trails. Eric marveled at the way the wolves moved, fluidly and instinctively. He tried to match their pace, his heart racing with excitement. After some time, they came across a small clearing, the ground dotted with patches of exposed earth where the sun had melted the snow. Eric knelt down, inspecting the ground. "This looks like a good place to find food," he said, glancing at the Alpha. "Let's see what we can uncover." As he began to dig through the snow, uncovering tufts of dried grass and hidden roots, Eric felt a sense of camaraderie with the pack. They were all working together, each member contributing to the hunt for sustenance. It was a dance of cooperation, a testament to their shared will to survive. While Eric rummaged through the earth, he suddenly felt a jolt of adrenaline. A faint rustle caught his attention. He froze, glancing toward the underbrush. The wolves went still as well, their ears perked up, sensing the shift in the air. Just then, a young deer emerged from the thicket, cautiously stepping into the clearing. Eric held his breath, knowing that the wolves were in prime hunting mode. The deer, unaware of the impending danger, continued to graze, blissfully ignorant of the predator lurking nearby. The alpha lowered itself, muscles taut with anticipation. Eric could feel the tension in the air, an electric current of instinct and primal energy. It was a reminder of the delicate balance of life in the wild, the predator and prey dynamic that dictated their existence. "Go for it," Eric whispered, barely able to contain his excitement. He had witnessed the wolves' prowess before, but this time he was even more invested, feeling an emotional stake in their survival. In a flash, the alpha launched itself toward the deer, the rest of the pack following suit. Eric watched in awe as the wolves moved in unison, their sleek bodies weaving through the snow with incredible speed. The chase was exhilarating, a wild dance of life and death unfolding before his eyes. The deer sprang into action, leaping through the snow, but the wolves were relentless. They pursued with a ferocity that filled Eric with both fear and admiration. He felt a sense of awe for the raw power of nature. This was survival at its most primal. After a tense chase, the pack cornered the deer, their instincts guiding them through the chaos. In a swift, calculated motion, the alpha lunged, bringing the deer down with a powerful bite. Eric's heart raced as he felt the weight of the moment settle in. As the pack celebrated their success, Eric felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for the food, respect for the life that had been taken, and a deeper understanding of the cycles of nature. They were not just surviving, they were thriving together, each member playing a vital role in the ecosystem around them. Once they had fed, Eric joined the pack in their rest. He laid beside the alpha, feeling the warmth of its body against his skin. The other wolves curled up around him, creating a protective circle. As he closed his eyes, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Hours passed, and Eric woke to the sounds of the wilderness: the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the distant call of a wolf. The sun had shifted in the sky, casting a warm glow over the landscape. He felt rejuvenated, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The alpha nudged him gently, drawing his attention. Eric sat up, realizing it was time to continue their journey. They had to find a more permanent shelter, as the winter weather was becoming increasingly unpredictable. "Let's move," Eric said, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through him. The pack stood ready, their eyes focused and alert. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Eric noticed the beauty of the forest in winter. The branches were heavy with snow, sparkling like diamonds in the sunlight. The air was fresh and invigorating, and he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. They trekked through the wilderness, navigating hills and valleys, crossing streams, and climbing over fallen logs. Each step was a reminder of the strength he had gained since joining the pack. He was no longer just a man on a hike. He was part of a larger story, a thread woven into the tapestry of life. After a few hours of travel, they stumbled upon a cave nestled within a rocky outcrop. The entrance was hidden by a thick curtain of evergreen branches, providing a natural camouflage. Eric felt a spark of hope. "This could be perfect," he said, excitement bubbling in his chest. The alpha approached cautiously, sniffing the air before entering. Eric followed closely, feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Inside, the cave was spacious, with smooth walls and a dry floor. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could find refuge from the harsh elements outside. As they settled in, Eric took a moment to reflect on how far he had come. The darkness of the cave enveloped them, but it felt safe and warm. He could hear the soft breaths of the wolves, their bodies pressed against one another for warmth. They were a family, bound by survival and shared experiences. That evening, as night fell and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Eric sat at the mouth of the cave, gazing out at the world beyond. He felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. In the solitude of the wilderness, he had found a place of belonging, a connection that transcended words. But as the moon rose high, casting an ethereal glow over the snow-covered landscape, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The wilderness was a realm of uncertainty, and he knew that challenges lay ahead. Just then, a howl echoed through the night, reverberating across the valley. It was a haunting sound, a call that sent shivers down his spine. The wolves stirred, their ears perked up, eyes gleaming with alertness. "Stay close," Eric whispered, instinctively drawing nearer to the pack. He felt the urgency in their posture, the instinctual drive to protect their territory. The howl came again, closer this time, and Eric's heart raced. He glanced at the alpha, whose expression was a mix of vigilance and authority. This was a warning, a reminder that in the wild, danger was always lurking just beyond the horizon. "Whatever it is, we're ready," Eric thought, determination flooding through him. He had come too far to back down now. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united as a pack, man and wolves, forged in the heart of the wild. The call of the wild. The night wore on, with the haunting howls echoing across the valley. Eric felt a surge of adrenaline, his instincts firing as he stood shoulder to shoulder with the wolves. They were a formidable presence, a collective force forged through shared struggles and mutual respect. The alpha stood at the mouth of the cave, surveying the snowy landscape, alert to any sign of danger. Eric knew that the wilderness was a realm of constant vigilance, where survival depended on instinct and intuition. "Whatever is out there," he whispered, "we'll face it together." As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight poured into the cave, casting golden hues across the rocky walls. The howls had faded into the night, but a tension lingered in the air. Eric rose early, eager to assess their surroundings. He knew they had to be prepared for anything. Outside, the world was transformed by the overnight frost. The snow crunched beneath his feet, and the air was biting but invigorating. He glanced back at the pack, who were slowly rousing from their slumber, yawning and stretching as they emerged from the warmth of the cave. "Let's scout the area," Eric suggested, and the alpha nodded, leading the pack into the wilderness. They moved through the snow with purpose, the wolves falling into formation around him. It was a beautiful sight, powerful, graceful creatures moving with an unspoken understanding. As they journeyed further from their temporary refuge, Eric's thoughts drifted to the challenges they might face. He recalled the warnings about predators in the area, other packs of wolves, or even larger creatures that roamed the mountains. Survival in the wild was a delicate dance, one that required constant awareness. They made their way through a thicket of trees, and soon Eric caught sight of something moving in the distance. He raised a hand to signal the pack to halt. The alpha instinctively lowered its body, nose to the ground, as they approached cautiously. As they crept closer, Eric's heart raced at the sight of another wolf pack, larger and more aggressive in appearance. The alpha of this pack was a massive brute, standing tall with a coat of deep gray and piercing yellow eyes that glinted in the morning light. Eric could sense the tension between the two groups. They were two worlds colliding in the fragile fabric of nature. "What do we do?" Eric murmured, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He turned to the alpha by his side, searching for guidance. The alpha raised its head, fixating on the rival pack, an unwavering resolve in its gaze. They could either retreat or stand their ground. Eric knew that retreating might provoke aggression, while standing their ground could lead to conflict. The wilderness was not known for its mercy. "Let's show them we're not afraid," Eric decided, his voice steady. He took a step forward, and the alpha mirrored his movement, leading the pack into a unified stance. The other wolves bristled, but Eric could feel the strength of their bond, the trust they had developed. As the rival pack began to advance, Eric felt the adrenaline course through him. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, without warning, the other pack lunged forward, growling fiercely. "Stay close," Eric shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The wolves instinctively formed a protective circle around him. The growls intensified, echoing through the trees as the two packs clashed. It was a whirlwind of fur, teeth, and primal energy. Eric's heart pounded as he watched the alpha engage with the leader of the rival pack, the two fierce opponents locked in a battle of strength and strategy. Eric could see the determination in the alpha's eyes, a fire fueled by the need to protect its territory and those it cared for. The clash was brutal, each pack vying for dominance, their growls reverberating like thunder in the cold air. Eric could only stand back and watch, his heart racing. He felt a mixture of fear and pride, knowing that he was part of something greater, a living testament to the raw power of nature. As the fight raged on, Eric noticed that the rival pack seemed to be gaining the upper hand. Their numbers were greater, and their attacks were coordinated, leaving little room for error. The alpha of his pack was fierce, but Eric could see exhaustion beginning to set in. "Come on," he urged, willing the pack to rally. "We can't let them take what's ours." In that moment, he felt a surge of energy and determination. He had to do something. The bond he shared with the wolves transcended words. It was an instinctual understanding that they were in this together. Eric's heart was in his throat as he recalled the tales his father had told him of courage and loyalty, of standing up for what was right. With newfound resolve, Eric sprinted toward the fray, raising his arms as he shouted, "Get back! Leave them alone." The wolves glanced at him, momentarily distracted. The rival pack hesitated, confused by the unexpected intervention. That momentary lapse was all the alpha needed. With a powerful leap, it pushed back against its opponent, rallying the other wolves to follow suit. Eric's presence ignited a fire within the pack as they pushed back with renewed vigor. Together, they formed an impenetrable line, their growls resonating with strength and unity. The rival pack, faced with this fierce display of loyalty and determination, began to retreat, realizing they were outmatched. As the dust settled, Eric stood there, breathless and exhilarated. The alpha turned to him, eyes shining with gratitude and respect. In that moment, Eric understood that he had proven himself, not just as a man, but as a member of the pack. "Let's head back," Eric said, a sense of accomplishment swelling within him. They moved away from the clearing, leaving the confrontation behind. The pack followed closely, their spirits lifted by their shared victory. Once they returned to the cave, Eric felt a sense of camaraderie that he had never experienced before. They had faced a formidable opponent and emerged victorious, but more than that, they had solidified their bond. As they settled into their sanctuary, Eric couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. From a solitary hiker haunted by loss to a man forged in the fires of adversity, he had found purpose in the wild. He had learned that strength came not just from survival, but from unity and the connections formed along the way. Later that night, as they huddled together for warmth, Eric listened to the soft sounds of the pack breathing around him. He felt a profound gratitude for the experience, the love, and the acceptance they had offered him. "This is my home now," he whispered to himself, allowing the words to sink in. The wilderness had become a sanctuary, a place where he had forged a new life and discovered a family he never knew he needed. As the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting silver shadows on the ground, Eric closed his eyes and let the peacefulness wash over him. He was no longer just a man searching for solace. He was part of something extraordinary, an adventure that had shaped him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. But deep down, he knew the wilderness would continue to test him, to challenge his spirit and resolve. Each day would bring new trials, and he was ready to face them, shoulder to shoulder with the wolves who had become his family. Together, they would conquer the wild, united in their struggle and their love for one another.